Alright, we've covered evidence for evolution and natural selection, and a little bit about classification. Now we're going to continue on to classification. Well, more of classification, that is. Last time we talked a little bit about natural classification, which is based on ancestry, and if organisms are related by ancestry, they will tend to have similar features. So they would have homologous features, even though those structures might not be used for the same purpose, they have an evolutionary origin. On the other hand, you might have convergent evolution, where you have similar structures being developed due to similar needs, and that would be analogous structures. But we're going to take a look at homologous structures that are shared due to similar ancestry, and the taxonomy that we get out of that. First, we're going to go over basic taxonomy of plant groups. The first group of plants we're going to talk about are the bryophytes. These are simple plants. They are multicellular. They reproduce through sexual reproduction and through spores, but they have no vascular system. They have no way to transport water materials over large distances, and therefore everything has to be passed through the process of diffusion, which limits their size. Otherwise, diffusion isn't very fast, so if it gets too big, you can't diffuse enough material to keep the cells alive. The next group we're going to cover is the Felicynophyta, or better known as the ferns. Now, they still reproduce sexually, they still reproduce asexually through spores, and the new development in this group and the advantage they have over the previous group, the bryophytes, the mosses, is that they are now vascular. They have a transport system, so they can grow bigger because they can transport the materials over larger distances. After that, we have the Coniferophyta, which includes pine trees and evergreens, and these have the further development of seeds. Now, we're not talking about flowers here, we're talking about seeds. So previously you had primarily sexual reproduction in place, with spores being the spore generation being the generation that is dispersed. Now, with the seed-bearing plants, they can disperse as seeds, whereas the spores tend to be more for sexual reproduction and for producing the seeds in the long run. And we're not going to go into the life cycle of plants here. I have another lecture on there later in the curriculum. Alright, finally, the last group would be the Angiospermophyta. The angiosperms, which are the flowering plants, and of course the development here is flowers. So you have it has all the characteristics of the previous. It has vascularization, it has spores, it has sperm, and it has seeds. So you have here a simple view of the development of complexity of life, and starting off with the simple mosses, bryophytes, to vascularization with the ferns, seeds with the Coniferophyta, and finally flowering plants, the angiosperms. Similarly, we have increasing levels of complexity seen in different taxa of animals, going from sponges all the way to vertebrates. So let's start off with the simplest ones, the sponges. These are your basic animal, the basic multicellular animal. Of course, there are single-cellular animals, the protista, but we're concerned with multicellular life right now. So sponges, multicellular. Then we have Cnidara, which have now developed a second tissue layer. So porifera, tissues, roughly, and multicellular, but just one, no organized layers. Cnidara, you have two tissue layers, an ectoderm and an endoderm, outside and inside. In the endoderm, you have actually formed a gastrovascular cavity, so you can now digest things external to the cells. After the Cnidara, you have the Platyhelminthes, the flatworms. This is a marine version. Then there are quite a few more parasitic ones, including the Chinese liver flute, but I thought the marine worm would be more picturesque and pleasant to view. This development in this group would be a third tissue layer. So you still have compacted tissue layers, no real space in them except for the gastrovascular cavity, but you've gone from tissues to two tissue layers to three tissue layers. an ectoderm, an endoderm, and a mesoderm between the two. Nematodes, which are not shown here, take that endoderm and physically separate it from most of the mesoderm to create just a thin lining for the gastrovascular tract that is completely separate, going from mouth to anus. So now you have a one-way digestive tract where previously you had a two-way. The mouth is the area that everything goes in and everything goes out. Now with nematodes, you go in through one end and go out through the other. But that's not a true body cavity. That's just a separation between the layers. For a true body cavity, we have the mollusks, which have several unifying characteristics, including a foot for movement. It has a visceral mass where the organs are located, and it has a mantle. Now, next, following the mollusks, you have the annelids. The annelids have, of course, everything shown before, talked about before, but now they have repeated segments. These are simple segments, but with repeated body plans with slight variations from beginning to end, depending on specialized groups of segments, but now you see repetition. Beyond that repetition, you have specialized segmentation. Arthropods, which include insects, crustaceans, and other exoskeletal beasties. Again, you have segmentation before, now you have segmentations that are specialized for specific purposes. Now after that, all of those previously, all of these are protostomes, which mean that the first opening develops into the mouth. After this, you have the first deuterostomes, the echinoderms, which have the first opening in that develops turning into the anus. Now, the echinoderms are also special in that they're the first set of organisms that you actually see an internal skeleton. Now, it's not a skeleton like you're familiar with mammals, but it is a carbon-based skeleton a lot of times that has a layer of flesh over it. So even though the layer is thin, it is still covering the skeleton. So you have internal skeleton there. And finally, you have the chordates, which does not necessarily mean it has a spine. If it has a spine, that's a vertebrate. The chordates, however, have a notochord and a central nervous cord and several other unifying characteristics. Okay, now, so this is the animals, which ranges from simple to our vertebrates, which we, as vertebrate-centric, consider one of the most evolved forms. But each of these taxa are adding more and more characteristics, more and more complexity as you go on, just as we saw in the plants. As mentioned, within the chordates, you have the vertebrates, which also show their own levels of complexity. So let's start off with the fish. Now, the fish, you have several groups of fish. You have the lamprey eel, sharks, and regular fish. This, I believe, is a grouper. These are examples of the three different complexities within the fish themselves. So you have the basic fish, then this one's jawless, jawed fish, but these two still have a cartilaginous skeleton, and then you have an ossified skeleton in what we usually consider as the regular fish, the fish that you tend to eat. Now, next in that level, you have development of organisms that have both gills and lungs, and also legs, 4 legs. Tetrapods. So after that, these would be your amphibians. After that, you have your lizards, which have developed an amniotic egg, and also scaly skin. That skin is composed of compacted keratin, which can actually be expressed in different ways, including feathers, which led to birds. And the birds have the amniotic egg, and they also have an endothermic system, meaning that instead of being cold-blooded, they're considered warm-blooded. They produce their own heat. They're not reliant on the environment to keep them warmed up. A third way that keratin can be expressed would be in hair. This stuff. And that can be used to keep the body warm, but the main addition, that's just an alteration of an already extant characteristic. The main addition that mammals have that increase the complexity of the system would be the development of mammary glands. The mammals are able to feed their young from their own bodies instead of having to collect food and bring them back to the young. Alright, so that was a quick look at the different taxonomic groups. Next time we'll be looking at how we can figure out what is what by keying them out using those characteristics that I've mentioned, in addition to others that I have not yet mentioned. But the goal is for you to eventually be able to look at different characteristics and being able to figure out, okay, I know it has A, B, and C, therefore it must be species X, Y, or Z.